The February wind cut through Shenandoah National Park like a knife through fabric, carrying with it snowflakes that would soon blanket everything in white. It was February 8, 2024, and two recreational hikers were following the Devil's Den Trail, their boots crunching through fresh powder from the previous night's storm. They had come to photograph the winter landscape, but what they discovered would finally solve a mystery that had haunted Virginia for 29 years. The avalanche had been unusual for the area. A combination of heavy snowfall and rapid temperature changes had caused a section of the mountainside to collapse. As the hikers approached the disturbed area, something caught their eye. A dark opening had appeared in the rock face, previously hidden behind centuries of accumulated earth and vegetation. Inside that cave, investigators would find the remains of 4 people and a cassette recorder that had been recording during their final moments on December 15, 1995. Before we begin the story, let us know in the comments which city you're watching from. We're really curious where you're tuning in from. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel and leave a rating. Dorothy Campbell had been 24 years old when she organized the winter hiking expedition. A graduate student in environmental science at the University of Virginia, she was known for her meticulous planning and infectious enthusiasm for the outdoors. Her professor later recalled, "Dorothy never did anything halfway. Every trip was planned down to the minute, every piece of equipment checked twice." She had received news just 3 days before the trip that would have changed her life: a prestigious research grant worth $50,000 to study the impact of climate change on Appalachian ecosystems. The news of the grant had spread quickly through her small circle of friends. Dorothy had called her roommate, Patricia Miller, immediately after receiving the letter. Patricia, 23 at the time, was struggling with student loans that had ballooned to $15,000. Dorothy was so excited, a mutual friend remembered. She kept saying this grant would let her do the research that really mattered. Patricia had congratulated her, but witnesses later noted a tension in their apartment that hadn't been there before. Richard Hart, Dorothy's ex-boyfriend, had learned about the grant through the university grapevine. At 26, Richard was working on his own graduate degree in geology. Their relationship had ended just 2 months earlier, and friends described the breakup as particularly bitter. Richard couldn't accept it was over, one classmate recalled. He kept showing up at places he knew Dorothy would be. When Dorothy announced the hiking trip at a department gathering, Richard had immediately volunteered to join, claiming he needed to collect rock samples from that area for his thesis. The 4th member of their group seemed the most innocuous. Christopher Winters, known to everyone as Chris, was 22 and worked at the outdoor equipment store where Dorothy regularly shopped. He had helped her select gear for numerous expeditions and had built a reputation as someone who knew every trail in Shenandoah like the back of his hand. When Dorothy mentioned the upcoming trip while buying supplies, Chris had offered his expertise. "The weather can be unpredictable in December," he had told her. "You'll want someone who knows the emergency routes." On the morning of December 15, 1995, the group had checked in at the park entrance at exactly 7 a.m. Park Ranger Benjamin Fox remembered them clearly, even nearly 3 decades later. 4 young people, all properly equipped, all in good spirits, he would tell investigators in 2024. The young lady, Dorothy, she was the leader. Very organized, had all their permits ready, detailed itinerary filed. The ranger had noted the time carefully in his log, a habit that would prove crucial decades later. The last photograph of the group together was taken at 11:30 a.m. at Stony Man Summit. In it, Dorothy stands in the center, her red jacket bright against the white landscape, surrounded by her three companions. Richard stands to her left, slightly apart from the group. Patricia is on Dorothy's right, arm around her roommate's shoulders. Chris stands behind them all, his face partially obscured by ski goggles, one hand raised in a wave. The camera's timestamp would later become a critical piece of evidence. At 2:15 p.m. that afternoon, an emergency beacon was activated in the Devil's Den area. The signal was brief, lasting only seconds before cutting out. Search and rescue teams initially dismissed it as a malfunction. Such false alarms were common with the older emergency equipment used in the 1990s. Chris would later claim he had accidentally triggered it while adjusting his pack, a story that seemed reasonable at the time. The weather began to deteriorate around 3 p.m. Heavy snowfall reduced visibility to mere feet, and the temperature dropped rapidly. According to meteorological records pulled in 2024, this was not the severe storm Chris would later describe, but rather a typical winter weather pattern for the area, challenging but not life-threatening for experienced hikers with proper equipment. At 9:45 p.m., a figure emerged from the darkness at the park entrance. Ranger Fox was just ending his shift when Chris Winters stumbled into the visitor center, ice crystals in his beard, his jacket torn. "There's been an accident," he gasped. "The others, they took a different route. I tried to find them when they didn't show up at the meet point." His distress seemed genuine, his story plausible. The storm had worsened, he explained, and the group had decided to split up to cover more ground for Richard's geological survey. The search began immediately, despite the darkness and continuing snowfall. Chris led teams to where he claimed they had separated, describing in detail how Dorothy had insisted on taking the more challenging route to reach a specific observation point for her research. "I tried to talk her out of it," Chris told searchers, his voice breaking. "But you didn't know Dorothy. Once she made up her mind about something, there was no changing it." For 3 weeks, search teams combed every trail, every possible route through the park. Chris was there every day, arriving before dawn, staying until after dark. He provided detailed maps with his own handwriting, marking areas he considered dangerous, routes the group might have taken. The other hikers' families watched him with gratitude. Here was someone who hadn't given up, who was doing everything possible to find their loved ones. Among Dorothy's belongings left in her car, investigators found her journal. One entry, dated December 12, stood out. "C getting weird about grant money. Jealousy is so ugly." Everyone assumed she meant C. Miller. Patricia's middle initial was C, after all. It seemed natural that there might be friction between roommates when one received such a windfall while the other struggled with debt. This interpretation would go unchallenged for 29 years. The search was finally called off in January 1996. The official conclusion was that the 3 hikers had become disoriented in the storm, likely falling victim to hypothermia. Their bodies would be found eventually, officials assured the families, probably in spring when the snow melted. But spring came and went, then summer, then years, then decades. Dorothy Campbell, Richard Hart, and Patricia Miller had vanished as completely as if they had never existed. Chris Winters became something of a local hero in the aftermath. He established a small memorial at the Park Visitor Center, contributed to a scholarship fund in Dorothy's name, and spoke at safety seminars about the importance of staying together in severe weather. He left his job at the outdoor store a year later, citing trauma from the loss of his friends. He moved to Colorado, where he started a successful outdoor gear company, eventually returning to Virginia in 2010 as a wealthy entrepreneur and philanthropist. The discovery in the cave on February 8, 2024, changed everything. The remains were remarkably preserved by the cold, dry conditions. But it wasn't just the bodies that told a story. It was what was found with them. A torn piece of Chris's jacket, the same distinctive blue and yellow pattern visible in photographs from 1995. Emergency beacons that had never been activated, still in their sealed packaging. And most damning of all, a cassette recorder that Dorothy had brought to record field notes, its voice-activated feature having captured fragments of what happened in those final hours. The investigation that began in February 2024 brought together cold case detectives, forensic anthropologists, and digital restoration specialists. Detective Sarah Chen, who led the task force, had not even been born when the 4 hikers disappeared, yet she approached the case with the determination of someone who had been waiting 29 years for answers. We had better technology, better understanding of evidence preservation, and most importantly, we had the element of surprise, she would later explain at a press conference. The first priority was identifying the remains conclusively. DNA testing confirmed what investigators had suspected. These were indeed Dorothy Campbell, Richard Hart, Patricia Miller, and a 4th set of remains that initially puzzled investigators. The 4th body would prove to be another hiker, Marcus Stone, who had been reported missing from a different area of the park 3 days before Dorothy's group arrived. This discovery immediately raised questions about the official narrative from 1995. The cassette recorder, a Sony TCM 939 model, popular with students in the 1990s, had been Dorothy's constant companion on field trips. The device was damaged, its plastic casing cracked, the magnetic tape partially degraded. Audio forensics expert Dr. James Liu spent 3 weeks carefully extracting what he could from the deteriorated tape. Voice-activated recording was still primitive in 1995, he explained to investigators. It would start recording at loud noises or raised voices, then stop during silence. We had fragments, like pieces of a conversation with long gaps between. What Dr. Liu recovered sent chills through the investigation team. The tape contained Dorothy's voice, cheerful at first, describing the botanical features of the trail. Then Richard's voice, making a joke about the cold. Patricia laughing. Normal trail conversation. But there was a 4th voice on the tape, one that made Detective Chen's blood run cold. It was Chris Winters, speaking in a tone completely different from the helpful, concerned survivor persona he had presented for nearly 30 decades. "This way is safer," his voice said on the tape. "Trust me, I've done this route 100 times." The investigation turned to Chris Winters, now 51 years old and a respected member of the Virginia business community. His outdoor gear company, Summit Safety Solutions, had contracts with parks across the state. He served on the board of several conservation organizations and had recently been honored for his contributions to hiking safety education. When investigators arrived at his sprawling estate outside Richmond, they found him in his study, surrounded by photographs from his many expeditions. "I've been expecting you," Chris said calmly when Detective Chen showed her badge. His demeanor was composed, almost relieved. He didn't ask why they were there or express surprise about the discovery. Instead, he offered them coffee and suggested they sit in his living room, where a large window overlooked the Blue Ridge Mountains in the distance. The interview lasted 6 hours. Chris maintained his original story with remarkable consistency. The group had split up, he had searched for them, the storm had been severe. But Detective Chen had done her homework. Weather records from December 15, 1995 showed no severe storm in the area Chris claimed to have been. The snowfall had been moderate, visibility reduced but not severely. More importantly, the timestamp on the park exit log created an impossible timeline. "You signed out at 9:45 p.m., Detective Chen pointed out. "You claimed you hiked from Devil's Den to the visitor center in 6 hours through a severe storm." But even in perfect conditions, that route takes a minimum of 3 hours. In a storm, it would be 8 to 10 hours. So either you left the group much earlier than you claimed, or you took a different route entirely. Chris's composure began to crack. He asked for water, his hands trembling slightly as he reached for the glass. The detective continued pressing, presenting each piece of evidence methodically. The torn jacket found with the bodies, Chris had claimed he lent it to Dorothy in the morning, but photographs showed him wearing it at noon. The emergency beacons still in their packaging. If the group had really been in trouble, why hadn't they used them? And then there was Dorothy's journal entry about C getting weird about grant money. Everyone thought she meant Patricia C. Miller, Detective Chen said, watching Chris's face carefully. But Dorothy was very precise in her writing. She always referred to Patricia as Pat or Patricia in her journal, never just C. The only person she consistently referred to by a single initial was you, Chris. You were C in her journal. And you were the one getting weird about the grant money. The detective pulled out photocopies of other journal entries, highlighting references. C helped with equipment today. C knows so much about the trails. And then, from December 10, C asked again about my research plans, getting uncomfortable with how interested he is in the grant details. Chris's attorney arrived then, ending the initial interview, but investigators continued building their case. They discovered that Chris had been discharged from the Marine Corps in 1994 after serving 4 years, including a deployment to Somalia during Operation Restore Hope. His military records, finally unsealed by court order, revealed several incidents of violence during his service, attributed to combat stress. He had been ordered to undergo psychological evaluation before his discharge, but had never completed the recommended treatment. Former Marines who had served with Chris painted a picture of a man changed by his experiences in Mogadishu. He came back different, one squad mate recalled. Paranoid, jumpy, always talking about how people were trying to take advantage of him, trying to steal what he had earned. Another remembered Chris becoming fixated on perceived slights, unable to let go of grudges. Someone would make an offhand comment, and Chris would bring it up weeks later, like it had just happened. The investigation uncovered Chris's financial situation in 1995. Despite working at the outdoor equipment store, he was drowning in debt from failed business ventures. He had applied for several grants and loans to start his own guide service, but had been rejected repeatedly. When Dorothy received her $50,000 grant, Chris had seen it as another example of undeserving people getting what should have been his. Meanwhile, forensic analysis of the scene provided more pieces of the puzzle. The bodies had not been scattered, as would be expected if the group had gotten lost in a storm. Instead, they were found together in the cave, positioned in a way that suggested they had been moved there deliberately. The fourth victim, Marcus Stone, showed signs of having died several days before the others, his body likely already in the cave when Dorothy's group arrived. The torn map found with the bodies, covered in Chris's handwriting, told its own story. What Chris had presented to searchers as helpful markings of dangerous areas were actually revealed to be a carefully planned route that led the group away from main trails and toward the isolated cave. The markings showed knowledge of the area that only someone who had extensively scouted the location would possess. Digital forensics experts managed to extract more from the damaged cassette tape. In one fragment, Dorothy's voice could be heard saying, "Chris, this isn't the way we discussed." His response was muffled, but the tone was aggressive. Another fragment captured what sounded like an argument, with Richard's voice saying, "Just let us go back," followed by Chris saying something about, "Too late now." The investigation revealed that Chris had purchased several items in the days before the trip that he hadn't disclosed: rope, additional flashlights, and a quantity of zip ties. Store records from 1995 were sparse, but a credit card statement showed purchases at a hardware store 2 days before the hiking trip. When questioned about these purchases in a second interview, Chris claimed they were for general equipment maintenance at the store where he worked. Patricia Miller's family provided a crucial piece of information. Patricia had called her mother on the morning of December 15th, excited about the trip but mentioning something odd. She said Chris was being very insistent about taking a specific route, her mother recalled. Patricia thought it was strange because Dorothy had already planned everything out, but Chris kept pushing for changes. Patricia just laughed it off, saying boys always had to be in charge. The Zippo lighter found among the effects in the cave became a critical piece of evidence. While initially dismissed as just personal property, closer examination revealed an engraving. USMC 1990-1994 Winter's Sea. This proved Chris had been in the cave, contradicting his story of never reaching the location where the group supposedly disappeared. When confronted with this evidence, Chris's attorney claimed his client might have lent the lighter to someone in the group, but investigators found this explanation unconvincing. Phone records from 1995, archived by the telecommunications company, showed Chris had made several calls to the Park Service in the days before the trip, inquiring about weather conditions and ranger patrol schedules. He had specifically asked about coverage in the Devil's Den area, claiming he was planning a solo photography expedition. These calls had never been mentioned in his original statements to investigators. The financial motive began to crystallize as investigators dug deeper into Chris's past. In November 1995, just weeks before the hiking trip, Chris had been denied a substantial bank loan he needed to prevent foreclosure on property he owned. He had also been passed over for a promotion at the outdoor equipment store, the position going instead to someone with less experience but a college degree. Friends from that time remembered Chris becoming increasingly bitter about what he saw as a system rigged against veterans like himself. He kept talking about how civilians didn't understand what real sacrifice meant, a former coworker recalled. He'd see these college kids getting opportunities and money, and it would set him off. He was especially angry about research grants, saying the money should go to people who had served their country, not privileged academics, as he called them. Detective Chen's team also discovered a pattern of behavior that had gone unnoticed for decades. After the 1995 incident, Chris had inserted himself into several other missing person cases in Virginia state parks. He would volunteer for search parties, offer his expertise, and often become a spokesperson for hiking safety in the aftermath. While this had been seen as admirable dedication to preventing future tragedies, investigators now wondered if it was something else entirely, a need to relive and control the narrative of what had happened. The breakthrough came when investigators discovered that Chris Winters had made a critical error in his calculated deception. Among the evidence recovered from the cave was a small digital watch, its LCD display long since faded. However, forensic technicians managed to extract data from its memory chip, a feature Chris couldn't have known about in 1995, as such technology was cutting edge at the time. The watch had belonged to Patricia Miller and contained a primitive data logger that recorded altitude changes. The data showed the group had been stationary in the cave for over 4 hours before the recorded time of death, completely contradicting Chris's story of a group separated by weather. On March 15, 2024, Detective Chen sat across from Chris Winters for what would be their final interview. This time, the evidence was overwhelming. The prosecutor had authorized an arrest warrant, but Chen wanted to give Chris one last chance to explain himself. He sat in the interrogation room, looking older than his 51 years, his hands folded on the metal table. "The watch data doesn't lie, Chris," Detective Chen said quietly. "Patricia's watch shows you were all in that cave together for hours. The voice recorder captured fragments of conversation. We know you were there. We know Marcus Stone was already dead in that cave when you led the group there. What we don't know is why." Chris stared at the table for a long moment. When he finally looked up, his eyes were hollow. "You wouldn't understand," he said. "Nobody who wasn't there could understand." The detective waited, letting the silence build. She had learned long ago that silence was often more powerful than questions. "Somalia," Chris finally continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "October 3rd, 1993. The Battle of Mogadishu. 18 Americans died that day, but the ones who survived, we died too, in a different way." His hands clenched and unclenched rhythmically. "My squad was pinned down for 14 hours. We ran out of ammunition, water, hope. The only reason I survived was because I took shelter behind the bodies of my friends." Detective Chen remained silent, recording every word. "I came back to nothing," Chris continued. "No parade, no opportunities, no understanding. Just nightmares and a discharge because I couldn't stop seeing their faces. And then I'm working in a camping store, watching kids like Dorothy get handed $50,000 to go count plants. 50,000. Do you know what that money could have meant to the families of the guys who didn't come home?" The confession that followed was rambling, sometimes incoherent, jumping between past and present. Chris admitted he had found Marcus Stone's body 3 days before Dorothy's trip. Stone had died in a climbing accident, his body hidden in the cave. Chris had seen an opportunity, a place where no one would look, where he could... He struggled to articulate what he had planned. "I didn't mean for it to happen," he said, his voice breaking. "I just wanted to scare them, to make them understand what real fear was. Dorothy kept talking about her important research, how she was going to change the world. Richard acted like he owned the mountain because he studied rocks. Patricia complained about her student loans like it was the end of the world. They had no idea what real problems were." Chris described how he had led them to the cave, claiming he knew a shortcut to a spectacular viewpoint. The storm had provided perfect cover. Once in the cave, he had revealed Marcus Stone's body, using it to terrify the group. But something had gone wrong. The PTSD he had thought was under control had surged back. The cave had become a bunker in Mogadishu. The hikers had become enemies. "I can't remember everything," Chris admitted, tears now flowing freely. "It's like I was back there, The sounds, the smells, the fear. When I came back to myself, it was over. It was over. I spent hours trying to figure out what to do. Finally, I decided to make it look like they had gotten lost. I sealed the cave entrance with rocks and debris, made it look natural. Then I hiked out using an old smuggler's trail I had discovered years before. The confession matched the physical evidence perfectly. The forensic team had found traces of limestone dust on Chris's torn jacket that matched the specific composition of rocks used to seal the cave. The smuggler's trail he mentioned explained how he had reached the visitor center in an impossible time frame. It cut 3 hours off the journey, but was so dangerous it had been officially closed in 1987. Detective Chen asked about the emergency beacon that had been triggered at 2:15 p.m. Chris nodded slowly. That was my first attempt to establish an alibi. I triggered it deliberately, then claimed it was an accident. I needed something to explain why we might have separated, why I might have gone for help alone. The manipulation had been meticulous. Chris had spent years inserting himself into the narrative as the helpful survivor, the safety advocate, the man traumatized by the loss of his friends. He had built an entire identity around being the one who had tried to save them. His successful business had been founded on the reputation he had cultivated as someone who understood the dangers of the wilderness. Every safety seminar I gave, every time I talked about staying together in bad weather, I was reinforcing my own lie, Chris admitted. After a while, I almost believed it myself. There were times I could convince myself it had really happened the way I said. The investigation uncovered the full extent of Chris's deception. He had carefully monitored any developments in the case over the years, using his position in the outdoor community to stay informed. When new search technologies were developed, he would volunteer to help, always steering teams away from the cave area. He had even contributed to a documentary about the missing hikers in 2010, tearfully recounting his version of events for the camera. The families of the victims were notified before the arrest was made public. Dorothy Campbell's mother, now 78, had never given up hope of finding out what happened to her daughter. 29 years of not knowing is its own kind of torture, she said at a press conference. At least now we can properly lay her to rest. Richard Hart's sister, Rebecca, struggled to process the revelation. Chris spoke at Richard's memorial service, she said, disbelief evident in her voice. He cried with us. He held my mother while she sobbed. How could he have done that, knowing what he had done? Patricia Miller's family had the most complex reaction. Patricia's younger brother, now 50, had actually worked with Chris's company on several projects. He was always so helpful, so concerned about safety, he said. I thought he was honoring my sister's memory. To find out he was the reason she needed to be memorialized, I don't have words for that betrayal. The arrest of Christopher Winters on March 20, 2024, made national headlines. The successful businessman and safety advocate was charged with 4 counts of murder, including Marcus Stone, whose death was now considered suspicious rather than accidental. The investigation suggested Stone might have witnessed something Chris didn't want revealed, though the exact circumstances remained unclear. During the arrest, Chris appeared almost relieved. Neighbors watched as he walked to the police car without resistance, his head held high. One witness said he heard Chris say to the officers, I've been waiting for this knock on the door for 29 years. The trial preparations revealed even more disturbing details. A search of Chris's home uncovered what investigators called a shrine to the incident. In a locked room in his basement, he had kept newspaper clippings, photographs, and even personal items belonging to the victims that he had somehow retrieved before sealing the cave. Dorothy's compass, Richard's geological hammer, Patricia's field notebook, all carefully preserved like trophies. Psychological evaluation of Chris revealed severe, untreated PTSD, compounded by what experts called moral injury from his combat experiences. Dr. Jennifer Walsh, a forensic psychiatrist, testified that Chris had created an elaborate justification system for his actions. In his mind, he was a warrior wronged by society. The victims became symbols of everyone who had failed to recognize his sacrifice. The cave became a battlefield where he could finally win. The discovery also led to a review of other missing person cases in Virginia parks during the late 1990s. While no additional crimes could be definitively linked to Chris, investigators found his presence at the edges of several cases. Always helpful, always volunteering, always steering the narrative. The full extent of his activities might never be known. As the legal proceedings continued, the outdoor community grappled with the revelation. Summit Safety Solutions lost all its contracts within weeks. The safety seminars Chris had conducted were reviewed, with many organizations horrified to realize they had been taking advice from a killer. The scholarship fund in Dorothy's name, to which Chris had contributed substantially over the years, voted to return all his donations to his victims' families. The cassette recorder's full audio was eventually restored using advanced AI-assisted reconstruction technology. While much remained unintelligible, one clear fragment stood out. Dorothy's voice, calm despite the circumstances, saying, "Chris, this isn't who you are. You can still make this right." His response, captured just before the recording ended, was chilling in its clarity. "This is exactly who I am. You just never bothered to look." In his jail cell awaiting trial, Chris wrote lengthy letters to veterans organizations about the importance of mental health treatment. He seemed to finally understand what he had become, though understanding brought no peace. Guards reported he barely slept, spending nights writing what appeared to be apologies to his victims that he would then tear up and start again. The forensic evidence continued to mount. DNA analysis revealed skin cells under Dorothy's fingernails that matched Chris, suggesting a struggle. The pattern of injuries on the victims indicated they had been subdued using military combat techniques. The positioning of the bodies showed a methodical, almost ritualistic arrangement that forensic psychologists said reflected Chris's need to maintain control even after death. One of the most damning pieces of evidence came from an unexpected source. In 2001, Chris had given an interview to a veterans magazine about overcoming trauma. In it, he had said, "The key to healing is keeping your secrets buried deep. Some things should never see the light of day." The interviewer had thought he was speaking metaphorically about emotional trauma. The 2024 investigation gave those words a horrifying new meaning. The prosecutor, District Attorney Michael Rodriguez, announced he would seek life without parole rather than the death penalty, citing Chris's military service and untreated PTSD as mitigating factors. This decision sparked controversy, with some victims' families wanting the maximum punishment, while others supported showing mercy to a veteran failed by the system. Chris's defense team attempted to build an insanity defense, arguing that PTSD had rendered him unable to distinguish right from wrong during the incident. However, the elaborate cover-up and decades of deception suggested a clear consciousness of guilt. The prosecution argued that while PTSD might explain the initial violence, it couldn't excuse the calculated concealment and ongoing manipulation. As the trial date approached, set for September 2024, more details emerged about December 15, 1995. Cell tower data, previously thought lost, was recovered from archived backup systems. It showed Chris's cell phone had been stationary in the cave area for the exact hours he claimed to have been searching elsewhere. This technical evidence demolished any remaining possibility of his innocence. The impact on Shenandoah National Park was significant. Visitor numbers dropped by 30% as the story made national news. Park officials implemented new safety protocols and mandatory check-in procedures for winter hikers. A memorial was erected near the Devil's Den Trail honoring Dorothy Campbell, Richard Hart, Patricia Miller, and Marcus Stone. Chris Winter's name appeared nowhere on it. In a final ironic twist, investigators discovered that Dorothy's research grant would have included funding for a project on trauma and environmental therapy for veterans. She had planned to collaborate with the local VA hospital, using nature immersion to help treat PTSD. Her notes, recovered from the cave, outlined a program that might have helped someone exactly like Chris. The case file, when finally complete, ran to over 3,000 pages. It documented not just a crime, but a tragedy of untreated trauma, missed opportunities, and lives cut short. Detective Sarah Chen, reflecting on the investigation, said, "This case haunts me not because of what happened in that cave, but because of what could have been prevented. 4 young people with their whole lives ahead of them, and 1 damaged veteran who needed help he never received. There are no winners here, only losses compounded over 29 years." On August 15, 2024, as final trial preparations were underway, Chris Winters was found dead in his cell. He had suffered a massive heart attack during the night. Guards discovered him at 6 a.m. during routine checks, clutching a final letter addressed to the families of his victims. In it, he had written simply, "I'm sorry. I was lost in a war that never ended. Your loved ones deserved better. You deserved the truth. I hope my death brings you what my confession couldn't, peace." The families were left to grapple with an incomplete resolution. No trial, no formal justice, just an ending as sudden as the beginning had been 29 years ago. Dorothy's mother spoke for all of them when she said, "We wanted him to face justice, but perhaps this is justice of a different kind. He lived with his guilt for 29 years. That might have been a harsher sentence than any court could impose." The case officially closed on September 1, 2024. The remains of all 4 victims were finally released to their families for burial. Dorothy Campbell was laid to rest in Charlottesville, her grave marker reading, "Brilliant scientist, devoted friend, taken too soon." Richard Hart was buried in Richmond, his geology hammer placed with him. Patricia Miller's family chose cremation, spreading her ashes in the mountains she had loved. Marcus Stone, whose family had waited the longest for answers, was given a full military funeral, a fellow veteran, even if his killer had been one too. The legacy of the case extended beyond the immediate tragedy. It sparked national conversation about veteran mental health services, the treatment of PTSD, and the dangerous gaps in the system. The Shenandoah Four, as they became known, inadvertently became symbols of a larger failure, Not just of one man, but of a society that sends people to war and then fails to help them find peace. Chris Winters was cremated without ceremony, his ashes unclaimed. His estate, worth several $1 million, was distributed among his victims' families by court order. Most donated the money to various causes: veteran mental health services, park safety programs, and scholarship funds. Dorothy's mother used her portion to establish the grant Dorothy had won but never got to use, funding climate research by young scientists. The cave where it all happened was permanently sealed by the Park Service, its entrance covered with concrete and marked with a simple plaque. In memory of those lost, December 15, 1995. May they rest in peace. Hikers sometimes leave flowers there, though few know the full story of what happened within. In the end, the Shenandoah case served as a reminder that some mysteries, when solved, bring not satisfaction, but sorrow. The truth, buried for 29 years under rock and lies, had finally emerged like the avalanche that started it all. Sudden, overwhelming, and forever changing the landscape it revealed.